Great Responsibility, Chapter 19, Home. Piper crept in through her private entrance to Avenger's tower, hoping against hope that the Avengers had been called out on a mission. She was not so lucky, as the elevator stopped on the family level instead of her private level. She might have convinced, or in reality slightly reprogrammed, Jarvis to ignore her frequent comings and goings, and to keep quiet about all things Spider-Girl that went on in the tower, but he did help Tony parent most of the time. It wasn't that Tony was a bad parent, but he didn't really know what he was doing. Though that meant that Piper had plenty of leeway to slip off and be Spider-Girl, it also meant that whenever anything happened that was even semi-dangerous, Tony got a bit overprotective. This was evidenced by him immediately wrapping her in a hug when she stepped off the elevator. She hugged him back and spotted Natasha's eyes narrowing at the bandages on her hands.
"You all right, Pipes? I knew that Osborn kid was bad news."
Piper laughed lightly. "Dad, this was not Harry's fault. Nobody knows where that thing came from or why it showed up at his house." Tony huffed, clearly annoyed. Clint laughed and held out a large mug of hot chocolate to Piper. She grinned and took it. Clint gave her bandages a cursory glance before making his excuses and heading up to his level. Piper knew a full med kit would be waiting for her in her bathroom when she reached her level.
"The point remains. He threw a giant house party and it devolved into people getting hurt. And it seriously sounded like it was the most last-minute party ever."
Piper laughed lightly. That's probably because it was. She proceeded to explain, using a slightly altered version of events. Tony knew she had been to detention last week. He'd bought her ice cream afterwards, insisting that a teen's first detention was a milestone. He had been in and out of detention quite a bit during his short high school career. Tony pouted slightly. "None of us are partiers, Dad. I don't expect it to happen again." Tony rolled his eyes slightly.
"All right, but if it does, it happens here. Seriously, I could throw a party 10 times cooler than anything Osborn could."
Piper laughed. Her adoptive father and Norman Osborn were constantly in competition. She and Harry laughed about it a lot. "I'm pretty sure that if half the people at my school found out I'm your kid, they would die on the spot. Just of sheer shock." Tony laughed. Piper sat down at the large kitchen table and sipped her hot chocolate.
"So, aside from Osborn's disaster of a party, how was today?"
Piper grinned. "It was actually pretty awesome. Remember I told you about my friend Eddie Brock?" Tony nodded, taking a seat across from his adoptive daughter. "Well, he's back. He goes to Midtown High now. He's a year ahead of me, but still. It's really cool to get to see him again." Natasha had to hold back a laugh at the look on Tony's face. He was very protective of his daughter, especially when it came to boys. If Piper wasn't such an oblivious idiot, he would have had quite a bit more work on his hands, trying to keep boys away from her, though the whole Iron Man thing might work with most of them.
"That's great."
Piper grinned wider. "Yeah, I'm thinking of inviting him, MJ, and Harry over for a movie night, if that's okay." Natasha could practically see the twitch in Tony's eyebrow, but he couldn't say no to Piper's puppy dog eyes. No one could. If Natasha didn't know better, she'd say it was another superpower, but she'd been able to do it long before she became Spider-Girl.
"That sounds like fun, but there will be supervision."
Piper grinned and hugged her father before downing the last of her hot chocolate. Then she yawned. "I'm beat. I'm going to bed." Tony ruffled her hair.
"Sleep tight, Pipes."
Piper grabbed her bag and walked back to the elevator. "Night, Dad." Tony grinned and turned to talk to Natasha, but she was gone. He sighed. He'd never get used to living with an assassin. Piper made it up to her room and hissed slightly. Her hands hurt like hell. She knew that her healing factor could fix the damage once she got all of the glass out. She walked into her room and found Natasha waiting for her. Several towels were laid out, and there was the first aid kit she had no doubt Clint had put out for them. Natasha held out her hands for Piper's. She carefully unwrapped the bandages and began to remove the glass that remained in her hands before rewrapping them. Then she pulled Piper into a hug. Piper sniffled.
"Bauchuk, tell me what happened."
Piper began to explain everything while Natasha listened. She spoke about how she had been taken over by the symbiote and how she couldn't even really comprehend what she was seeing or feeling anymore. Like she wasn't a person anymore. Natasha ran a hand through the teen's hair as she spoke, looking down at the bandages on her hands. Natasha pulled Piper in for another hug and rubbed her back soothingly. Piper was in tears by the time she finished the story. Natasha told her to change into her pajamas and that she would be right back. The Black Widow snuck off to the kitchen, grabbing a small stack of cookies and some chocolate from her stash before making it back to Piper's room. Piper was still in her bathroom, so Natasha cleaned up the first aid kit and set down the snacks on Piper's bedside table. Piper came out of her bathroom in a set of Captain America PJs. Natasha smiled. Piper grabbed a bar of chocolate and sat down on the bed next to Natasha. She pulled her into a hug again.
Your darkness does not define you, Bauchuk. The fact that you were able to beat it, looked it in the face, and took it down, that defines you.
Piper buried herself in Natasha's side. Natasha smiled at the teen. As Piper fell asleep, she began to hum a lullaby. She remembered few things from her days before the Red Room, but that lullaby was one of them. She knew she couldn't have children. The Red Room's graduation ceremony was too effective. But if she ever had kids, she hoped they would be like Piper. Sweet, smart, and kind. She ran her hand through the teen's hair again. She hoped that Piper would be okay. An experience like that could seriously mess with your head. Natasha had had her identity stripped away in the Red Room, and her grip tightened on Piper's shoulder at the thought of her going through something similar. The door creaked slightly as it opened, and Natasha slipped a hand into her pocket where she always kept a knife, just in case. Clint peeked through the door, and Natasha relaxed.
How's she doing?
Natasha smiled at the sleeping teen, then up at her partner.
She had some glass healed into her hands, but other than that, she's physically okay.
Clint sat down next to Natasha at the head of the bed.
And mentally?
Natasha frowned slightly.
Time will tell. Being ripped out of your own head, forced to face every dark thought you've ever had. It's hard. Harder when you have to face it alone.
Clint laid a hand on Natasha's shoulder.
Good thing she's not alone, then.
Natasha smiled. Meanwhile, back at Osborn's currently empty penthouse, a dark shadow crept in through the still broken window. He wore almost all black, only a white collar of his costume and his shocking white hair visible in the darkness. He laughed lightly. This was child's play. With both Osborns staying at a ritzy hotel until their window could be fixed, there was nothing to get in his way. He expertly circumvented the security system and made it to the safe he was looking for. He cracked it easily. Smiling, he raided the jewelry that was left there. He grinned and grabbed a small box out of the safe. Popping it open, he found a small note sitting on top of a beautiful set of sapphire earrings.
To Piper, happy birthday, love, Harry. Aw, that's so cute. Might as well leave him that. Guy sounds like he likes her a lot. Those are real sapphires, after all. He's trying.
Slipping out of the window, the cat burglar crept back across the city into a small apartment. He set down his bag of loot and pulled off the short wig and mask. Felix Hardy sat down in his kitchen table and laughed as he checked out his haul. Chapter 20, A Break. Eddie glanced around the library. In all honesty, he wasn't sure if she'd even be there, but hey, he could hope. He spotted the short brunette Bob he was looking for at one of the tables farthest from the doors. Piper had her back to him, but from the way she was curled around her computer, he could tell she was concentrating hard. He walked over to her and grabbed a book off the shelf as he got a good look at her for the first time in a week. She looked down in the dumps. There were dark bags under her eyes, and he hadn't seen her smile since the disaster of a party. She had her headphones on and was fiddling with something on her computer in the dark corner of the library. Eddie set down his books on the other side of the table, and Piper jumped, pulling one of her headphones out of her ear. It was their free period, and she could normally be found in one corner of the school or another, avoiding Flash Thompson and reading. But that didn't seem to be the case here. Eddie grinned at her headphones, which had the purple arrow that had become associated with the ex-assassin turned Avenger, Hawkeye.
Those are cute. He your favorite?
Piper laughed quietly, glancing down at her headphones. One of them, yeah. Her smile was short and slightly forced. Eddie frowned, trying to peek over her shoulder at what she was working on, but she slipped the sleek black laptop closed before he could get a look at it. He shrugged.
You okay, Pipes? You've been off since the party.
Piper stared down at her now closed laptop. In truth, she was not okay. The feeling of being ripped out of her own head, trapped, watching herself hurt her friends, it messed with her head. She and Clint were meeting up whenever they both had free time, and he and Natasha were the only ones who really understood what that was like. But she couldn't exactly tell Eddie that. I'm working on a side project. Something for a friend. That was an outright lie. Truth be told, she was trying to find a match for the voice that had rang from the symbiote's mind into hers, using the Avengers files on known villains. Danny had confirmed that he'd heard another voice as well as the hissing, spinning one of the symbiotes. The others couldn't remember much. None of them could figure out why only she and Danny had synced with what seemed to be Venom's memories. None of them were clear, though. Muddled flashes were all she'd been able to discern. That and a voice, echoing the same words through her head over and over again.
Distilled aggression. Pure venom.
Piper glanced up and unclenched her fist. Her knuckles had been cracking and she hadn't even noticed. She shook her head in an attempt to clear it. Sorry, I've just been distracted lately. Eddie nodded.
Yeah, I noticed. You're working too hard.
Piper nodded and just managed to hold in a derisive snort. He had no idea how hard she was working these days. It was nuts how much she managed to do in one day. There was training with the team, school, solo Spidey time, which almost didn't happen anymore, as at least one member of the team decided it was an excellent time to tag along. Then there was training at home, helping her dad and Uncle Bruce work on their projects, and her pseudo-therapy sessions with Uncle Clint and Auntie Natasha. Her plate was so full, she hadn't had a chance to schedule movie night at her place. Eddie's frown deepened, then a mischievous glint found its way into his eyes.
I have an idea. Have you ever played hooky before, Piper?
Piper chuckled. You, of all people, should know I would never do that. Eddie's grin widened.
Come on, it's our free period. No one's gonna miss us till next period, and I know for a fact you are the biggest teacher's pet, and they won't care if you miss one class.
Piper laid her head on her laptop.
Come on. We both need a break from this place.
Piper smiled and nodded, stuffing her laptop into her bag. You're right. I could use a break. Eddie grinned and grabbed her hand, leading her out of the school building, both of them holding back laughter. Harry was sitting in his geometry class, staring out the window, when he spotted Eddie leading Piper out of the school building to where several cars and a single motorcycle were parked. Eddie pulled 2 helmets out of the saddlebags of the bike and handed one to Piper before setting her bag into the bag and zipping it closed. He pulled on his own helmet and Piper mounted the bike after him. They drove off into the afternoon sunlight of a beautiful spring day. Harry stared after them. Felix Hardy was treating himself today. His successful heist had landed him enough of a haul to live comfortably for quite some time, so he decided to go out and have a little fun today. For him, that meant hitting Coney Island like he and his father used to. He frowned at the thought. His father was still rotting in prison for what he'd done nearly 4 years ago. He shook off the bad memories and leaned on the railing that separated the amusement park from the river. There were 2 kids around his age leaning nearby, a tall, blonde boy built like a linebacker and a small, bookish-looking brunette. Having nothing better to do, he listened to them talk. Seriously, Eddie, I needed this. Next game's on me, though. The blonde smiled, plucking a piece of cotton candy off the large purple mass the girl was holding. His grin was stained purple when he smiled. She snorted a laugh and shivered slightly. The blonde took off his black leather jacket and slung it around her shoulders. They were cute together, Felix mused as they wandered away towards the carnival games. He smiled, looking out over the river as the sun began to dip low on the horizon. Piper took aim and lobbed the baseball into the precise center of the tower of bottles, sending them all falling and spinning to the ground. She cheered and bounced as the man in the carnival stand shook his head, clearly impressed. Well, I gotta say, you got a good arm on you, miss. You ever considered playing baseball? Piper shook her head as she picked out her prize from the top shelf. She ended up choosing a giant stuffed version of the Hulk that was nearly the length of her torso. Eddie laughed as she bounced back over to him. Maybe all the sugar had been a bad idea, but Piper was happy, so he was happy. They made their way over to another game. This one was throwing darts at balloons. Piper was again much better than Eddie had expected her to be. She won a plastic version of Thor's hammer in this game, and it seemed to amuse her to no end.
You really like the Avengers, don't you?
Piper nodded, her smile turning slightly mischievous. You could say that. There was a ringing from Piper's pocket, and Eddie took the large plush Hulk, which was heavier than he'd expected, to let Piper easily answer her phone. She looked at the caller ID first and swore under her breath before she answered. Uncle Steve! Oh, did the school call? No, I'm at Coney Island with a friend. I'm glad you appreciate my honesty. You're mad at me. Oh, God, not the disappointed voice, please. I needed a break. There was a pause. The phone on the other side seemed to have switched hands. Uncle B, listen. Yes. Yeah, I know you never did anything like this. Another long pause. Piper looked on the verge of laughter. Hey, Uncle Clint. Yeah, I needed a break. I'm perfectly safe. Yes, I know Auntie Tasha and you were worried. I skipped class for the first time in 16 years to go play at Coney Island with a friend. Am I bringing him home? Piper looked over at Eddie and held in a laugh. I don't know if he's ready to meet the family, Uncle Clint. Another pause. Piper paled slightly. Hey, Dad. Yeah. Yes, I know it's irresponsible. Seriously? Okay. No, we'll follow him. Yeah, Dad, love you too. Piper hung up the phone and turned to Eddie. So, my dad's insisting that he meet you. Eddie nodded. Piper had mentioned a few times being adopted after her Uncle Ben had died, but she'd never been more specific than a passing mention. They headed towards the exit of the park, and Piper spotted a black Audi waiting near the entrance. Wait here. She took the plush from him and rushed over to the nearby unmarked car. She dropped off the prizes she'd won in the back seat, and the car waited to pull out of the lot until she was standing next to Eddie, who was thoroughly confused now.
I thought your dad wanted to meet me.
Piper nodded. He does, which is why we're heading to my place next. And be prepared, this is gonna get weird fast. Eddie frowned but got onto his bike, with Piper behind him, both wearing their helmets. Her directions led them to an hidden underground parking garage in the middle of Manhattan. She took off her helmet, placing it on the back of the bike and holding out a hand. If you're not too freaked out, we can keep going. If you're freaked out, I'll make your excuses and you can go. Eddie shook his head. This was his best, oldest friend. Just because her new family was odd didn't mean anything to him. So instead of running at the oddness of the situation and the nearly empty parking garage that they needed a code to enter, Eddie followed Piper to the doors of an elevator.